Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely dark, absolutely fascinating, and wildly misunderstood chapter of history. We're looking at a time when the world was already engulfed in chaos, only to be hit by something far, far worse. We're going to uncover how a microscopic virus became the second deadliest plague in human history, hiding quietly behind the smoke, gunfire, and propaganda of World War I. Part 1. Deadlier than the Great War. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this, but we really have to set the stage here. World War I claimed the lives of over 16 million people, a literal generation-defining trauma. But then, there's the 1918 flu. It killed at least 50 million people worldwide, and honestly, a lot of experts believe that number is probably closer to 100 million. How on earth does a single microscopic virus cause that level of devastation? Well, to figure that out, we've got to look at where it came from.
We can't pinpoint the exact origin with 100% certainty, but tracking the early outbreaks gives us a pretty good idea of how this global catastrophe fueled up. It might have kicked off with a severe respiratory outbreak in China's Shaanxi province back in 1917. Or, it could have been incubating right there in the incredibly unsanitary, disease-ridden trenches of World War I. We also see a massive red flag in the spring of 1918 at Camp Funston, a military base in Kansas, where 48 soldiers died of flu-like symptoms right before a much larger outbreak. So the origin is a bit murky, but there's one thing we know for absolute certainty. It definitely did not start in Spain.
Part 2. The Spanish flu myth.
So why the fake name? Well, nations fighting in the Great War heavily censored any reports of the flu. Neither the Allied nor the Central Powers wanted to admit they were losing even more lives. The war literally hinged on manpower, so looking weak, just not an option. Here in the US, citizens and journalists were actually terrified of reporting the true scale of the sickness. Why? Because they feared violating the Sedition Act of 1918. People were legitimately scared that warning the public about a deadly flu would be branded as disloyal language that undermined the war effort. So Spain ended up taking all the historical blame simply because they were neutral. They weren't fighting in World War I, which meant they had absolutely no strategic reason to hide their sick and dying from the rest of the world. When the flu swept through their borders and even knocked out their monarch, King Alfonso XIII, they just reported it openly. And because Spain was the only country being honest about the devastation, news outlets in the US and Europe just sort of slapped a label on it, forever nicknaming it the Spanish flu.
Part 3. A suffocating, gruesome death. When we think of the flu today, we think of a fever, some body aches, maybe a sore throat. It's miserable, sure, and it knocks you out for a few days. But the 1918 strain, it was a completely different, utterly horrific nightmare. Reading firsthand accounts from folks like U.S. Army Dr. Roy Grist at Camp Funston, you can literally feel the chilling reality these medical professionals were facing. They'd never seen anything like it. This wasn't just a bad cough. It was a rapid, brutal, and agonizing decline. The reality of this infection was just gruesome. We're talking dark spots erupting all over the body, skin turning blue from oxygen deprivation, patients actively bleeding from their ears and noses, and ultimately victims suffocating on their own bodily fluids. It's really heavy stuff. And remember that outbreak at Camp Funston we just talked about? It hit over 1,000 soldiers out of 1 million stationed throughout Kansas. What's truly terrifying is realizing those highly infected soldiers were then packed like sardines onto ships and sent overseas, carrying these deadly microbes and spreading them way faster than the war itself.
Part 4. Wartime spread and government lies. By the fall of 1918, a second, incredibly deadly wave of the flu slammed into both military bases and civilian cities. And because medical technology was, well, pretty limited, microscopes back then couldn't even see viruses yet, misinformation just ran completely rampant. Without vaccines, antiviral drugs, or even antibiotics to stop secondary infections like pneumonia, the public was entirely defenseless. Panic spread like wildfire, and wild conspiracy theories totally took over. People were desperate for a scapegoat, so they blamed their wartime enemies, claiming Germans were deploying poison clouds or even deliberately infecting Bayer aspirin. But here's the thing.
That misinformation wasn't just bubbling up from a panicked public. It was coming straight from the top. Public health officials flat out lied to maintain wartime morale. Take a look at this disastrously dismissive quote from Philadelphia's public health director. Right after a Navy ship loaded with infected passengers pulled into Boston, he publicly stated, "No concern whatever is felt." Wow. Just wow. The deadly cost of those official cover-ups escalated at a terrifying speed. On day 1, the ship arrives. By day 2, 2 sailors are dead. By day 3, 14 sailors are dead. All of this is happening while the public is actively being told, hey, don't worry about it. By hiding the truth just to protect the war effort, officials basically gave the virus a VIP pass to embed itself deeply into civilian populations. Once people started dropping in the streets and the truth became impossible to hide, prevention was stripped down to the absolute basics: quarantine and personal hygiene. This led to some pretty desperate local measures to force everyone to comply. Schools shut down, churches closed their doors. San Francisco actually went as far as fining people $5, which was a pretty hefty chunk of change back then, if they were caught out in public without a protective mask. They even publicly shamed them in the papers as mask slackers.
Part 5. The catastrophic human toll.
So what was the final damage here in the US? The flu killed roughly 675,000 Americans. To put that into perspective, that is vastly more Americans than died in World War I. Actually, scratch that. It's even crazier. That's more American soldiers dead from a microscopic virus than all American soldier deaths in the entire 20th century combined. The absolute peak of this horror hit in October of 1918. Nearly 200,000 Americans perished in a single month. That officially makes it the deadliest month in recorded US history. The reach of this virus was just absolute. I mean, even President Woodrow Wilson wasn't spared. He collapsed right at the Versailles Peace Conference with flu-like symptoms, exactly when the global death toll was reaching unprecedented heights. When you combine the forces of a global mechanized war and an unstoppable plague, the statistical fallout is staggering. The overall life expectancy in the United States plummeted by a massive 12 years. 12 years! That is how profoundly this virus impacted human survival across the board. Part 6. Legacy and the first vaccine. As we emerge from this dark chapter, it's wild to see how painfully slow the path to fundamentally altering medicine really was. It wasn't until 1933, a full 15 years after the pandemic struck, that scientists finally managed to isolate the influenza virus so they could properly study it. 5 years after that, in 1938, the very first flu vaccine was successfully developed. Interestingly, it was initially given to soldiers heading into World War II, and only after that conflict ended was it finally distributed to protect the general American public. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How much of modern medicine was born directly from the shadows of our greatest, most silenced historical tragedies? We have to ask ourselves how the horrific lessons learned from a devastating pandemic, one that was deliberately hidden behind the smoke and propaganda of a world war, fundamentally shaped the medical miracles that you and I just take for granted today. Millions died while the truth was censored, yet their loss eventually paved the way for the vaccines that currently protect us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it leaves you with a deeper appreciation for the incredibly fragile, fascinating history of human health.